The conference hall fell silent the moment Caden Ashford entered, and that silence was heavier than any scream could ever be. 200 alphas from across North America had gathered for the Continental Summit. Powerful leaders who commanded armies of wolves and controlled territories spanning thousands of miles. Yet every single one of them stepped back when the beast of Shadowpine walked through those doors. Caden didn't acknowledge them. He never did. His massive frame moved with predatory grace that seemed wrong somehow. Too fluid for something so large. Too calculated for something supposedly mindless with rage. The scars across his face told stories that most wolves wouldn't survive. 3 jagged lines that ran from his temple to his jaw. Souvenirs from the night everything changed, but it wasn't the scars that made grown alphas avert their eyes. It was what lived behind them, something dark and writhing and barely contained, something that made his eyes flash between human, brown, and a sickly yellow that belonged to no natural wolf. Sarah Whitlock watched him from her position near the medical station, her healer's instincts cataloging every detail with clinical precision. She'd heard the stories, of course. Everyone had. The alpha who'd been betrayed by his own beta and mate, ambushed during a peace negotiation and left for dead. The magic that had been used on him, old and forbidden, the kind that didn't just wound but corrupted, twisting a wolf's very essence, until they became something else entirely. The aftermath, when Caden had tracked down everyone involved and left their territories painted in blood. 37 wolves dead in a single night, not killed cleanly, not honored as warriors, but torn apart with such savage brutality that even the council had looked the other way, because some betrayals demanded that kind of reckoning. What the stories didn't mention was the way his hands trembled when he thought no one was looking, or how he positioned himself with his back always to a wall, or the exhaustion that lived in every line of his body like he hadn't truly rested in years. Sarah saw those things because she'd spent the last decade learning to read trauma written in flesh and behavior, working with refugees and broken wolves that other packs discarded. She knew what monsters looked like, and she knew what people who'd been turned into monsters against their will looked like. Caden Ashford was decidedly the latter. The summit proceeded with careful choreography designed to keep Caden as isolated as possible. Alphas spoke their pieces from safe distances, made their proposals and grievances to the council without ever directly addressing him, treated him like a bomb that might detonate if someone breathed wrong. He didn't seem to care, sitting alone at a table meant for 5, his presence warping the social geometry of the entire room. Sarah found herself studying him between her duties, fascinated despite herself, watching the way he tracked every movement in his peripheral vision, cataloging threats with mechanical precision. His coffee sat untouched in front of him, probably cold by now, but he never relaxed enough to drink it, never let his guard drop for even a second. When the lunch break was called, the exodus was immediate and obvious. Alphas practically fled to the courtyards and private rooms, anywhere that put walls and distance between them and Shadowpine's monster. Sarah stayed. She had medical, supplies to restock and incident reports to file, the mundane paperwork of keeping 200 territorial predators from killing each other. But also, something pulled at her. That same instinct that had led her to every broken soul she'd ever helped. She watched Caden sit alone in that emptying hall, isolated by fear and reputation, and felt an ache of recognition so profound it stole her breath. She knew what it felt like to be the thing everyone feared. She'd been there once, marked as dangerous simply for surviving what should have broken her, treated as damaged goods by a pack that saw her trauma as contagion. It had taken her years to claw her way out of that hole, to reclaim her sense of self and build something meaningful from the ruins. And now, here was someone else in that same darkness. Except his cage was made of his own corrupted wolf and everyone's terror, and she suspected no one had even tried to offer him a key. If you're enjoying this story of monsters and the healers who see their humanity, hit that like button and let me know in the comments what you think Sarah should do. Should she approach Caden? Or is she walking into danger she can't imagine? Sarah made her decision without fully understanding why, gathering a fresh cup of coffee and a plate from the catering, spread before walking across that empty conference hall. Each step felt simultaneously like the most natural thing in the world and complete insanity. She could feel Caden's awareness lock onto her the moment she changed trajectory, his entire body going rigid with threat assessment. By the time she was 10 feet away, she could hear the low rumble building in his chest, a sound that vibrated through the floor and made her Omega instincts scream at her to submit, to flee, to do anything except keep walking toward imminent danger. She set the coffee and plate on his table and took the seat across from him, meeting those yellow-brown eyes directly. Up close, she could see the corruption more clearly. Dark veins spreading from the scars like ink in water, pulsing faintly with a sickly light that made her stomach turn. His wolf was right there beneath his skin, closer to the surface than should be possible in human form. And she could feel the wrongness radiating from him like heat from a forge. This wasn't just trauma or rage. This was poison, ongoing and active, slowly devouring him from the inside out. "You haven't eaten," she said simply, her voice calm despite the way her heart hammered against her ribs. "And that coffee's been cold for an hour. I'm Sarah Whitlock, Omega healer attached to the Great Lakes delegation." Caden stared at her like she was a puzzle he couldn't solve, his expression flickering between confusion and suspicion, and something that might have been desperate hope, before settling back into hostile neutrality. When he spoke, his voice was rough, damaged, the kind of voice that came from screaming until your throat bled and never quite healing right. "You should leave." "Probably," Sarah agreed, pushing the plate closer to him. "But I'm not very good at doing what I should. And you look like you're about 3 missed meals away from your wolf making decisions for you, which would be unfortunate given there are 200 alphas in this building who'd take any excuse to put you down." Something flickered across his face, too quick to name. But his eyes dropped to the food. She watched him war with himself, pride and suspicion, battling against obvious hunger and bone-deep exhaustion. His hands were still trembling, she noted, and the corruption veins pulsed faster when he was stressed. Whatever had been done to him, it wasn't stable. It was getting worse. Why? The single word came out almost broken, and Sarah understood she wasn't being asked why she'd brought him food. She was being asked why she wasn't running, why she dared sit across from a monster, why anyone would show him even this small kindness. "Because I've worked with corrupted wolves before," she said honestly. "Not to this degree, but enough to know what I'm looking at. And because everyone in this building has decided you're too dangerous to help, which is exactly how people die from treatable conditions. That magic eating you from the inside out is going to kill you eventually. Alpha Ashford. Maybe not today or tomorrow, but soon. And before it does, it's going to take whatever humanity you have left." His hands curled into fists on the table, claws extending involuntarily and gouging deep scratches into the wood. She could see him fighting for control, see the war happening behind his eyes as his corrupted wolf surged against his will. For a moment she thought she'd miscalculated, that he'd lose this battle, and she'd be dealing with a full manifestation in a confined space. But then he breathed out slowly, deliberately, and the claws retracted. The veins stopped pulsing quite so frantically. He'd won this round, but the cost was written all over his face. "You can't help me," he said flatly. "Better wolves than you have tried. The corruption is too deep, too advanced. All that's left now is managing the inevitable." Sarah leaned forward, holding his gaze with the kind of steady certainty she'd learned from years of dealing with wolves who'd given up hope. "I've heard that before. From wolves with silver poisoning that had spread to their hearts. From ones whose own packs had declared them beyond saving. I specialized in lost causes, Alpha Ashford. And I've gotten very good at proving conventional wisdom wrong. I'm not saying I can cure you, but I can buy you time. I can ease the symptoms. I can give you enough breathing room to actually live instead of just surviving." He studied her for a long moment, and she let him look. Let him assess and analyze and search for whatever angle she must be playing. She knew what he'd find. The same thing every desperate soul found when they finally looked at her without their defensive walls. Genuine care from someone who understood darkness because she'd lived in it. Recognition from someone who knew what it meant to be written off by everyone who should have helped. "What do you want in return?" Caden asked finally, because of course he did. People like him had learned that kindness always came with a price tag. Nothing, Sarah said simply. Except maybe for you to eat that food before it gets cold too. And to let me run some diagnostic scans after the summit. Sessions end today. If I'm right about the type of corruption, there are treatments that could slow the progression significantly. No promises, no miracles, but better than watching yourself dissolve one piece at a time. She stood then, giving him space to process, to decide, to maintain whatever illusion of control he needed. But before she left, she did something that surprised them both. She rested her hand briefly on his shoulder, just for a moment, her touch feather light but deliberate. She felt him freeze beneath that contact, felt every muscle lock rigid with shock. And beneath that shock, a desperate aching need for connection that he'd clearly been denying for years. "You're not a monster, Caden Ashford," she said quietly, using his first name deliberately, treating him like a person instead of a cautionary tale. "You're a wolf who had something terrible done to him and has been surviving the aftermath alone. That's not the same thing, even if everyone else has forgotten." The difference. She walked away before he could respond, before she could second-guess herself, before the weight of what she'd just done could fully settle on her shoulders. She didn't look back, but she felt his eyes on her all the way across that conference hall, felt the shocked disbelief radiating from him like heat. No one touched the beast of Shadowpine. No one dared. No one had in 3 years. Probably. Not since his mate's betrayal had taught him that any vulnerability was a weapon someone would eventually use against him. The afternoon sessions passed in a blur of territorial disputes and resource negotiations, but Sarah couldn't focus properly. She kept catching glimpses of Caden across the hall, noticing small changes in his behavior that probably no one else registered. He'd eaten the food. The coffee cup was empty. His posture had shifted fractionally. Still guarded, but not quite as rigidly defensive. And several times, she caught him looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher, something between suspicion and desperate hope and bone-deep confusion. When the sessions finally adjourned for the evening, Sarah was organizing her medical supplies when she felt his presence behind her. That overwhelming aura of power and barely restrained violence that announced him more effectively than any introduction. She turned slowly, keeping her movements calm and predictable, and found him standing at a careful distance, his body language screaming discomfort, but his eyes fixed on her with laser focus. "The diagnostic scans," he said without preamble. "How long would they take?" Sarah felt something warm unfurl in her chest, a small victory that she knew better than to celebrate too obviously. "An hour, maybe 90 minutes for a full workup. I have a treatment room reserved in the medical wing. It's private, warded, and has all the equipment I need." He nodded once, sharp and decisive, then hesitated. "If this goes wrong, if my wolf loses control during the examination, you need to promise you'll run. Don't try to help. Don't try to calm me down. Just get out and seal the room behind you. There are protocols for containing me if necessary." The fact that he'd thought this through, that he had protocols for his own containment, broke something in Sarah's heart, but she kept her expression professional, gave him the clinical nod he needed to hear. "Understood. Though for the record, I've dealt with corrupted wolves in full. Manifestation before and survived. I'm harder to kill than I look." That almost got a smile from him. Just a tiny quirk at the corner of his mouth that disappeared as quickly as it came. But she'd seen it, and it felt like a victory worth savoring. They walked to the medical wing in silence, Caden maintaining careful distance, hyper-alert to every sound and movement. The building had mostly emptied as alphas retreated to their accommodations, but the few wolves they passed gave them wide berth, staring at the unprecedented sight of someone walking willingly beside Shadowpine's monster. The treatment room was exactly as Sarah had promised. A converted hotel suite with medical equipment, protective wards carved into every surface, and enough space for even Caden's considerable frame to feel less claustrophobic. She could feel him assessing everything, checking sight lines and exit routes, confirming the wards were properly calibrated. He'd been a tactical genius once, she remembered from the stories, before the corruption had consumed so much of his attention, just managing his own instability. I'll need you to remove your shirt so I can get clear readings of the corruption spread, Sarah said, pulling on examination gloves and firing up the diagnostic equipment. The epicenter appears to be the scarring on your face and neck, but I need to see how far it's traveled through your system. Caden hesitated for a moment, then pulled his shirt over his head in one fluid motion, and Sarah had to consciously suppress her reaction. His torso was a map of violence, old scars layered over older ones, telling stories of battles and betrayals, and barely survived encounters. But it was the corruption that drew her clinical eye. Those dark veins spreading from his neck and face downward, covering his left shoulder and chest like someone had spilled ink across his skin. It was more extensive than she'd expected, and worse, it was clearly active, pulsing with that sickly light in rhythm with his heartbeat. She moved closer, holding up the scanning wand, and trying to ignore the way his entire body tensed at her proximity. Try to stay relaxed. I know that's probably impossible, but tension makes the readings less accurate. I'm just mapping the corruption's pathways. Nothing invasive. Nothing about this feels uninvasive, Caden muttered. But there was no heat in it, just exhausted honesty. His eyes tracked her every movement with predatory precision, but beneath the vigilance, she could sense him trying to comply, trying to trust despite every instinct screaming at him to maintain his guard. Sarah worked methodically, running the scanner over every inch of corrupted tissue, building a three-dimensional map of how deeply the magic had infiltrated. The readings were worse than she'd hoped, but better than she'd feared. The corruption had spread extensively through his lymphatic system and was beginning to affect his organs. But it hadn't reached his heart or brain yet. Those were the critical thresholds. Once corruption hit those areas, the wolf became completely unsalvageable, lost to mindless rage until someone put them down. "Talk to me," she said as she worked, partly to keep him calm and partly because she needed information. The night it happened, what kind of magic was used? Do you remember the ritual, the words, anything specific? She felt him go rigid, watched his jaw clench so hard she heard teeth grind. For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer, that she'd pushed too far too fast. But then he spoke, his voice distant and hollow. Lost in memory, he clearly wished he could forget. It was a full moon ritual, old pack magic from before the council era. They used my own pack bonds against me, channeled through my mate's connection since she was part of the conspiracy. The beta, Marcus, he'd been studying forbidden texts for months, learning blood magic and corruption spells that the council banned centuries ago. They wanted to destroy me slowly, make an example. Said Shadowpine had grown too powerful under my leadership, that I needed to be brought down. Sarah's hands stilled for a moment, absorbing the calculated cruelty of what he'd described. They hadn't just tried to kill him. They'd tried to unmake him, to turn him into the very thing he'd spent his life protecting his pack from. And the scars? Those came from the ritual? No. His laugh was bitter and broken. Those came after. When I realized what they'd done, what I was becoming, I tried to claw the corruption out myself. Obviously didn't work. Just gave myself some decorative scars to remember my stupidity. The casual way he said it, like self-mutilation in desperate hope of survival, was just another failure to catalog, made Sarah's throat tight. She moved to stand directly in front of him, close enough that he had to look at her instead of losing himself in that dark memory. That wasn't stupidity. That was survival instinct from someone who'd been poisoned and had no other options. You did what you thought you had to do to save yourself. His eyes met hers, and for just a moment, she saw past all the defenses and damage to the person he'd been before the betrayal. Someone strong and decisive, and probably kind. Someone who'd cared deeply about his pack and would have moved mountains to protect them. Someone who'd had that capacity for love and trust weaponized against him so thoroughly that he'd walled off those parts of himself, rather than risk being vulnerable again. "I killed them all," he said quietly, and she couldn't tell if it was confession or warning. Not just the ones directly involved. Anyone who knew and didn't stop it. Anyone who participated even indirectly. I painted Shadowpine in blood and didn't stop until every single traitor was dead. The council called it justified vengeance. I call it losing the last piece of myself that was still human." Sarah held his gaze steadily, refusing to look away from the pain and guilt and self-loathing she saw there. The council was right. It was justified. They tried to destroy you using the most intimate bonds of pack and mate. They earned what happened to them. She paused, then added more softly, "But that doesn't mean you don't get to grieve who you had to become to survive it. Those things can both be true." Something in his expression cracked, just for a moment. A flash of such raw emotion that Sarah had to resist the urge to reach for him. But she held herself still, gave him space to feel whatever he needed to feel without the pressure of her reaction. After a long moment, he looked away, his jaw working as he fought for control. "The scans," he said roughly. "What do they show?" Sarah recognized the deflection for what it was, and allowed it, turning back to her equipment and pulling up the completed analysis. "The corruption has spread further than ideal, but you're not past the point of treatment. Your wolf is fighting it constantly, which is actually keeping you alive, but also accelerating your physical deterioration because you're burning through resources at an unsustainable rate. It's like running a marathon every single day just to maintain baseline function." She pulled up a comparison chart showing normal wolf physiology versus his readings. The differences were stark and alarming. Your body temperature runs 3 degrees hotter than it should. Your heart rate is elevated even at rest. Your healing is compromised because all your energy is going toward containment instead of repair. You're essentially burning yourself out from the inside, and eventually, your wolf won't have the strength to keep fighting. That's when the corruption will take complete control. How long? The question was quiet but steady, and Sarah respected him for asking directly instead of dancing around it. Without treatment? 6 months, maybe less. Your baseline has deteriorated significantly in the last year based on these readings, which suggests the corruption is accelerating. With treatment, she pulled up a different projection, one that showed potential outcomes with aggressive intervention. "I can probably buy you 2 to 3 years. Maybe more if we can identify the specific spell components and develop targeted countermeasures. That's not a cure." It wasn't a question. "No," Sarah admitted honestly. "I don't know if a cure exists for corruption this advanced, but 2 or 3 years is time, Alpha Ashford. Time to get your affairs in order, to find and train a successor, to maybe even hunt down whoever taught your beta that ritual, and make sure it can't be used again. Time to live, instead of just counting down the days, until you lose yourself completely." She watched him process this, saw him running calculations behind those damaged eyes, weighing options and outcomes with the strategic mind that still existed beneath all the corruption and trauma. Finally, he nodded once, decisive despite the weight of what she'd just confirmed. "What do you need from me?" Sarah felt that warm unfurling in her chest again, pride in his courage, hope that maybe she could actually help. "Twice daily treatments to start, morning and evening. I'll need to synthesize a purgative compound based on these readings, something to help your body flush the corruption faster than it can spread. It won't be pleasant. You'll feel worse before you feel better, like having the worst flu of your life combined with withdrawal symptoms. But if you can push through the initial treatment phase, we should see measurable improvement within 2 weeks. And you can do all this while the summit continues?" Skepticism colored his voice. But beneath it, she heard desperate hope. "The summit runs for another week. That's enough time to get the treatment protocol established and train you to continue it on your own. I'll also prepare detailed instructions and compounds you can take back to Shadowpine." She hesitated, then added, carefully, "Though ideally you'd have someone with medical training to monitor your progress and adjust dosages as needed. Someone you trust." His laugh was sharp and bitter. "Trust isn't exactly my strong suit anymore, and I don't keep healers in Shadowpine. They're afraid of me, same as everyone else." "Then you'll manage on your own," Sarah said practically, though her heart ached at the isolation in his voice. "I'll make the protocols simple enough that you can't mess them up too badly. And we'll exchange contact information so you can reach out if you have questions or complications." The surprise on his face would have been comical if it wasn't so sad. Like the concept of someone offering ongoing support was completely foreign to him. "You'd do that?" Stay in contact with the beast of Shadowpine after the summit ends? I'd stay in contact with Caden Ashford, a wolf struggling with magical corruption who needs medical support. Sarah corrected gently. The beast is what other people see because it's easier than acknowledging what was done to you. I see a person who's been fighting alone for too long and could use someone in his corner. This time when their eyes met, something shifted. She saw the exact moment his walls cracked just a little further, saw him recognize that she meant every word, that this wasn't pity or obligation, but genuine care from someone who understood suffering. His hand moved almost unconsciously, reaching toward her before he caught himself, and let it fall back to his side. But she'd seen the impulse, the desperate need for connection warring with years of learned isolation. Make sure you're subscribed to this channel because this story is just getting started. And trust me, you won't want to miss what happens when Sarah starts treatment, and Caden begins to realize that healing isn't just about purging corruption from his body, but from his soul. The first treatment session happened in the pre-dawn hours before the summit resumed. With Caden arriving at her door looking like he hadn't slept at all, Sarah suspected that was normal for him, that rest was a luxury he couldn't afford when his corrupted wolf demanded constant vigilance. She'd prepared everything the night before, synthesizing a purgative compound from ingredients she'd begged, borrowed, and called in favors to acquire. The base was wolfsbane and silver, traditional purifiers, but she'd added components specifically tailored to combat magical corruption based on his diagnostic readings. "This is going to hurt," she warned him, as she drew the bright blue liquid into a syringe. "The compound targets corrupted cells preferentially, but it can't differentiate perfectly. Your body is going to react badly, and your wolf is going to hate it. You'll have about 30 minutes before the worst symptoms hit, and then you'll be pretty useless for the next 2 hours while your system purges." Caden rolled up his sleeve without hesitation, offering his arm with the kind of resignation that said he was used to pain, that it was just another currency he paid for survival. "Will I be coherent enough to attend the morning session?" "Probably not," Sarah said honestly, swabbing his skin with antiseptic. "You're going to need to miss today, maybe tomorrow too, depending on how your body handles this first dose. I'll let the summit organizers know you're undergoing medical treatment. They won't push for details." She could see him wanting to argue, to insist he couldn't show weakness by missing sessions. But practicality won out. He nodded tightly and watched as she found his vein and slowly injected the compound. For a moment, nothing happened. Then his entire body went rigid, every muscle locking as the purgative hit his system, and immediately went to war with the corruption. Sarah had warned him it would hurt, but she hadn't been able to adequately prepare him for this. She watched the corruption veins light up like someone had set them on fire, pulsing frantically as his body recognized and attempted to fight off the intrusion. Caden's breathing went ragged, his claws extending involuntarily as his wolf surged in defense. She could see the battle happening beneath his skin, could see his corruption trying to neutralize the purgative, even as the compound systematically hunted down corrupted cells and marked them for destruction. "Breathe through it," she coached, moving to his side and placing a steady hand on his shoulder, grounding him with physical contact. "Your body knows what to do. Let it work. Don't fight the process. Just ride it out." His hand shot out and grabbed hers, squeezing hard enough that she felt bones grind together. But she didn't pull away. She let him anchor himself to her. Let him pour all that pain and fear into that crushing grip, because that was better than him losing control and manifesting his corrupted wolf in a hotel room. She could handle crushed fingers. She couldn't handle him hurting someone and having to live with that guilt afterward. The 30-minute mark hit exactly when she'd predicted, and Caden made a sound that was half growl, half whimper, his free hand clawing at his chest where the corruption burned brightest. "It's killing me," he gasped out. "Feels like it's burning me alive from the inside." "It's killing the corruption," Sarah corrected, her voice calm and steady despite her racing heart. "Your body is purging poisoned cells. And yes, it feels like dying, because those cells have been part of you for 3 years. But you're not dying, Caden. You're healing. There's a difference, even if it doesn't feel like it right now." She guided him to the bed, helping him lie down as the purging intensified. His body temperature spiked dangerously high, sweat pouring off him as his system went into overdrive. She monitored his vitals constantly, ready to intervene if anything went truly wrong. But the readings showed exactly what she'd expected: accelerated cell death and corrupted tissue, massive immune response, extreme discomfort, but no actual danger. His body was doing exactly what it needed to do, even if the process was brutal. For 2 hours, Sarah stayed by his side, offering water when he could keep it down, cool cloths for his fever, and steady presence when the pain made him lose touch with where he was. He didn't scream, she noticed. No matter how bad it got, he kept the sounds trapped behind his teeth, like he'd learned long ago that showing pain was dangerous. But his hand never left hers. That crushing grip, the only outlet he'd allow himself. When it finally started to ease, when his temperature began dropping back toward normal, and his breathing evened out, Sarah felt tension she hadn't realized she was carrying drain from her shoulders. The worst was over for this round, though they'd have to repeat the process twice daily until his system adapted. She checked his vitals one more time, then the corruption readings, and felt a surge of fierce satisfaction. The veins had visibly faded, the sickly pulsing light dimmer than before. It was working. She'd bought him some breathing room, some time, some hope. Caden's eyes opened slowly, focusing on her with obvious effort. "Did I hurt you?" His first words, not asking about himself, but checking on her, and something in Sarah's chest went warm and soft. She held up her hand, showing the deep purple bruises already forming where he'd gripped her. "Nothing permanent. You held on pretty tight, but I've had worse from wolves half your size having panic attacks. These will fade in a couple days." Guilt flashed across his face, and he started to pull away, to retreat back into that isolation that kept him safe from hurting anyone else. But Sarah didn't let him. She kept her hand in his, squeezed back deliberately, making sure he understood this was choice, not obligation. "You didn't lose control," she said firmly. "You were in pain and scared, and your wolf was fighting for survival. But you didn't hurt me beyond some bruises, and you didn't manifest. That's incredible, Caden. Most wolves would have lost themselves completely in that situation. The fact that you held on shows how much strength you still have." He stared at her like she was speaking a foreign language, like the concept of someone praising him instead of fearing him was completely incomprehensible. "I could have killed you, but you didn't," Sarah countered. "And I don't make decisions based on could have. I make them based on what actually happens. What actually happened is you endured a brutal treatment, held onto your humanity despite massive provocation, and gave me some bruises that will heal. That's a win in my book." She could see him struggling to process this, years of self-loathing and isolation warring with desperate need to believe her. Finally, exhaustion won out, and he just nodded, too tired to argue. Sarah helped him get more comfortable, made sure he had water and something light to eat within reach, then settled into the chair beside the bed with her tablet to document the treatment results. "You don't have to stay," Caden said quietly. But she heard the unspoken plea beneath the words. "Please stay. Please don't leave me alone with this." "I know," Sarah replied easily, "but I want to monitor your recovery for the next few hours. Make sure there are no delayed reactions. Besides, I have paperwork to catch up on, and your room is quieter than the medical wing. Consider me your very persistent shadow for the immediate future." That got her another of those almost smiles, there and gone in an instant. But she counted it as a victory. Over the next few hours, she worked while he dozed fitfully, waking occasionally with confusion before remembering where he was and why. Each time his eyes found her first, like she was the anchor point he used to orient himself. And each time she saw a little more of that desperate hope breaking through his defensive walls. The afternoon session had just started when Caden finally woke properly, his color better and his eyes clearer than she'd seen them. He pushed himself upright carefully, testing his body's response, and Sarah set aside her work to run a quick diagnostic scan. The readings made her want to cheer. The corruption had measurably decreased, the veins less prominent, the sickly pulsing barely detectable. His baseline vitals had improved across the board. It wasn't a cure, not even close, but it was undeniable progress. How do you feel? She asked. Caden considered the question with unusual thoughtfulness, like it had been so long since anyone asked that he wasn't sure how to answer, honestly. Different, he said finally. Lighter, maybe? The constant pressure in my head, the feeling of my wolf pressing against my control every second. It's lessened. Not gone, but quieter. That's the corruption easing, Sarah explained, pulling up the comparison scans to show him the difference. Your wolf has been fighting a war for 3 years without break. Now that the enemy forces are reduced, he can actually rest a little. You both can. She watched his expression as he studied the scans, saw the moment understanding hit him. This was real. She'd actually helped. The impossible thing every other healer had told him couldn't be done. She'd done it, and more than that. She'd stayed. She'd held his hand through the worst of it, treated him like a person worth saving. Seen, past the monster to the suffering wolf beneath. Why? The question came out raw and wondering. Why do this for someone like me? You don't owe me anything. I'm not your alpha, not your pack. You could have just ignored me like everyone else and lived a safer, easier life. Sarah met his gaze steadily, weighing her words carefully because she sensed this moment mattered, that her answer would shape everything that came after. Because 3 years ago, I was in a pack that decided I was too broken to bother healing. I'd been abused by wolves who were supposed to protect me, and instead of helping me recover, my alpha declared me damaged goods and encouraged me to leave quietly. So I did. I left and spent 2 years being exactly as broken as they'd decided I was. She saw recognition flash in his eyes, saw him understand that she wasn't speaking theoretically, but from brutal personal experience. What changed? I met a healer who refused to accept that diagnosis, Sarah said simply. And I knew old Omega named Margaret, who'd dedicated her life to helping refugees and wolves everyone else had given up on. She took one look at me and said, "You're not broken, child. You're wounded. There's a difference, and wounds can heal if someone actually bothers to treat them." She taught me everything she knew, helped me reclaim my life, and showed me that sometimes the most important thing you can do is refuse to accept someone else's darkest moment as their permanent identity. Understanding settled over Caden's expression, deep and profound. So you see paying it forward. I see refusing to let good wolves be consumed by what was done to them. Sarah corrected gently. You didn't choose to be corrupted, Caden. That was inflicted on you by people who betrayed every bond of pack and honor. And yes, you've done dark things in response. But you've also been fighting alone against impossible odds for 3 years, and somehow haven't completely lost yourself. That deserves recognition. That deserves help. For a long moment, Caden just looked at her, and she let him search her expression for deception, or pity, or any of the things he'd probably trained himself to watch for. She knew what he'd find. The same thing she'd offered from the beginning. Honest care from someone who understood darkness intimately. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion he clearly didn't know how to handle. Thank you. 2 simple words, but they carried the weight of 3 years of isolation and pain, of desperate hope that maybe he wasn't completely beyond redemption. For seeing me, for helping, for not running when every survival instinct you have must be screaming at you to get away from the corrupted alpha. My survival instincts learned a long time ago that the most dangerous wolves aren't always the ones everyone fears, Sarah said with a slight smile. Sometimes they're the ones everyone trusts completely, the ones who hide their cruelty behind charm and authority. You're not dangerous to me, Caden. You're dangerous to yourself, maybe, and definitely to anyone who threatens you, but not to someone who's just trying to help. Comment below if you think Sarah is crazy for trusting him, or if she's exactly what Caden needs. And don't forget to like this video if you're invested in this story, because things are about to get even more intense when the conspiracy that corrupted Caden resurfaces and Sarah finds herself in the crosshairs. The second treatment that evening went smoother than the first, Caden's body already adapting to the purgative compound. He still suffered, still gripped her hand hard enough to leave new bruises over the old ones, but the peak intensity was lower, and the recovery faster. By the time they finished, he was exhausted but coherent. his eyes clearer than they'd been since the summit started. The change was remarkable, and judging by the way he kept catching his reflection in the mirror, he noticed too. The scars, he said, suddenly, touching the 3 jagged lines across his face with something like wonder. The darkness in them. It's faded. Sarah moved to examine them more closely, her healer's instincts cataloging the changes. He was right. The corruption veins that had spread from those scars like poisoned roots had diminished significantly, the sickly yellow-black fading to a dull gray. His eyes, which had constantly flickered between brown and that wrong yellow, were holding steady in their natural color. The change was cosmetic in some ways, but psychologically she suspected it was massive. He was starting to look like himself again instead of the monster everyone expected. The corruption is retreating, she confirmed. It's not gone, and it'll take sustained treatment to keep pushing it back. But you're winning. Your body is responding even better than I'd hoped. She prepared to leave, to give him privacy and rest. But Caden's voice stopped her at the door. Sarah, would you have dinner with me? Not as healer and patient, just as 2 people. I haven't had a conversation that didn't revolve around death or territory in 3 years. And I find myself craving normal, even if it's temporary. The vulnerability in that request, the careful hope in his voice, made Sarah's decision effortless. I'd like that. Give me an hour to clean up and grab some actual food from somewhere that isn't conference catering. I'll meet you back here? His smile was small and uncertain, like he'd forgotten how to make the expression and was relearning it in real time, but it was genuine. I'll be here. Where else would I go? Everyone's still terrified of me. Their loss, Sarah said firmly, means I get you all to myself for dinner and potentially fascinating conversation about anything except pack politics and territorial disputes. True to her word, she returned an hour later with Thai food from a place near the hotel, enough variety that Caden could choose what appealed to him. They sat on the floor of his room rather than the formal table, a casual intimacy that felt easier somehow. And then they talked, really talked, not as alpha and omega, not as healer and patient, but as 2 people who'd survived things that should have broken them and were still figuring out who they were in the aftermath. Caden told her about Shadowpine before the betrayal, painting pictures of a thriving territory with strong traditions and fierce loyalty. He'd loved his pack deeply, she realized, had poured himself into making them prosperous and safe. The betrayal hadn't just hurt him personally. It had shattered his fundamental belief that caring about others was a strength rather than a fatal weakness. He talked about the wolves he'd killed with frank honesty, not justifying but not hiding from it either, letting her see the guilt he carried alongside the grim satisfaction of justice served. Sarah shared her own story in return, the abuse she'd suffered and how it had nearly destroyed her sense of self. She told him about Margaret, the healer who'd saved her, and how learning to help others had been the path to healing herself. She was honest about the fact that she still had bad days, that trauma didn't just disappear because you worked through it, but that she'd built a life she was proud of despite everything. As they talked, Sarah noticed small changes in Caden that probably no one else would have registered. The way his shoulders gradually relaxed, losing some of that rigid tension that had seemed permanent, how his expressions became more animated, showing flickers of the person he'd been before the corruption, the dry humor that surfaced occasionally, surprising them both, suggesting that part of him hadn't been completely destroyed by 3 years of isolation and pain. Can I ask you something? Caden said eventually, when the food was mostly gone and the conversation had settled into comfortable quiet. That first day, when you sat across from me in the WOS conference hall, were you afraid? Sarah considered lying, softening the truth, but he deserved honesty. Terrified. My omega instincts were screaming at me that you were an apex predator barely holding on to control. Every rational part of my brain was listing reasons why approaching you was suicide. But underneath that fear, I saw something that overrode the panic. What? Recognition, she said simply. I saw myself 3 years ago, isolated and suffering, because everyone had decided I was too dangerous or too damaged to bother with. And I remembered how desperately I'd needed someone to see past that, to treat me like a person worth saving instead of a problem to be managed. So I decided to be for you what Margaret was for me, even if it scared me. Caden was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant as he processed this. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. I can't promise I'll always be safe to be around. The corruption is better, but it's not gone. My wolf is still unstable. Still capable of violence I might not be able to control. But I want you to know that you've given me something I thought I'd lost forever. What's that? Hope, he said simply. And there was such raw honesty in his face that Sarah felt her throat tighten. Hope that maybe I'm not completely broken. That maybe there's a version of my future that doesn't end with me losing my mind and having to be put down like a rabid animal. You've given me hope, Sarah, and I don't know how to thank you for that. Sarah reached across the small space between them and took his hand, no longer caring about professional boundaries or omega-alpha dynamics. You don't have to thank me. Just keep fighting. Keep choosing to survive. Keep believing you deserve better than what was done to you. That's all the thanks I need. His fingers curled around hers, careful despite his strength, like he was holding something precious and fragile. They sat like that for a long time, hands linked, sharing a moment of peace that both of them desperately needed. For the first time in 3 years, Caden Ashford wasn't alone with his suffering. And for the first time in longer than that, Sarah felt like her pain had purpose, had led her to exactly where she needed to be. Over the following days, they fell into a routine. Twice daily treatments, with Sarah monitoring his progress and adjusting compounds as his body adapted. Meals together, conversation that ranged from pack politics to favorite, books to stupid jokes that made them both laugh. Caden attended summit sessions when he was able, and Sarah noticed the way other alphas' reactions began to shift. He was still feared, still given wide berth, but there was less outright terror now. People could see the changes in him, the way the corruption was visibly receding, the way his control was more stable. He was becoming less monster and more person again. And it showed. But with improvement came complications. 3 days into treatment, Sarah ran a routine scan and found something that made her blood run cold. There, buried in Caden's corrupted tissue samples, was a magical signature. Not just any signature, but a specific pattern that she'd only seen once before, in research documents about forbidden ritual magic from the pre-council era. Caden, she said carefully, pulling up the analysis on her screen, this corruption wasn't random. It's structured, deliberately designed to be permanent and progressive. Whoever taught your beta this magic knew exactly what they were doing. He moved to stand behind her, studying the pattern she'd highlighted. What does that mean? It means this was never just about revenge or removing you as alpha, Sarah explained, her mind racing through implications. This was a test. Someone wanted to see if this particular corruption could be successfully implanted in a powerful alpha and remain stable. You weren't just attacked, Caden. You were an experiment. She watched his expression go cold and hard, the tactical mind that had made him such a formidable alpha clicking into gear. Then they'll have been monitoring me, checking to see if the corruption holds, if I survive long enough to provide useful data. And now that I'm actively being treated, now that someone is successfully reversing their work, they'll know. Sarah's stomach dropped as understanding hit her. They'll come after you. Or worse, they'll come after me to stop the treatment, or to capture you. And learn what you know, Caden added grimly. If they can successfully corrupt alphas, and you've developed a treatment protocol, you're arguably more valuable to them than I am. You're the variable they didn't account for. Before Sarah could respond, her phone buzzed with an emergency alert from Summit Security. There had been an incident in the medical wing. Her treatment room had been broken into, all her research notes stolen, and the synthesized compounds destroyed. Someone had moved fast, and efficiently knew exactly what they were looking for, and had the skills to bypass Summit security wards. Caden's wolf surged to the surface, his eyes flashing that yellow-brown as protective instincts overrode everything else. You're not safe here. If they're willing to raid the medical wing, they're not going to stop at stealing research. They'll come after you directly. Then we use me as bait, Sarah said, her mind already working through possibilities. They want to stop the treatment and eliminate me as a threat. Let's give them the opportunity, except instead of an easy target, they walk into a trap. She expected Caden to argue, to refuse to put her in danger, but instead he studied her with a calculating gaze that reminded her exactly why he'd been such an effective alpha. You're serious. You want to deliberately expose yourself to whoever's behind this conspiracy. I want to end this threat before it spreads, Sarah corrected. If they can successfully corrupt alphas, with this magic, they're not going to stop with you. This is bigger than one pack's internal politics. This is someone building a weapon that could destabilize the entire continental pack structure. We need to know who's behind it and shut them down. Caden was quiet for a long moment, clearly torn between protective instincts and tactical necessity. Finally, he nodded sharply. We do this together then. You're not going into danger alone. And we need allies. Wolves we can trust absolutely. Because clearly someone at this summit is compromised, or at least providing information to the enemy. They spent the next several hours planning, using Caden's strategic expertise and Sarah's medical knowledge to craft a trap that would draw out whoever was behind the conspiracy. The key was making it look like Sarah was vulnerable and isolated, continuing her research in a new location without adequate security. They'd leak information through carefully selected channels, set up surveillance, and wait for someone to take the bait. The waiting was the hardest part. Sarah set up a new temporary lab in a hotel room away from the main summit building, making sure to be visible coming and going, establishing a predictable routine. Caden stayed nearby but out of sight, his corrupted wolf's predatory instincts perfectly suited for hunting. They'd deliberately reduced his treatment dosage to let his corruption flare slightly, making him more intimidating, more obviously dangerous. Anyone watching would assume he was deteriorating again, would think Sarah was focused on her research and not expecting trouble. The attack came on the fourth night. 3 wolves in tactical gear who bypassed hotel security with practiced ease and moved on Sarah's location with obvious intent. She was ready, had been ready, but her heart still hammered against her ribs as she heard them approach. They didn't knock, didn't announce themselves, just kicked the door in with the kind of efficiency that said they'd done this many times before. Dr. Whitlock, the lead wolf said, his voice modulated through a voice changer. You're going to come with us quietly. We have some questions about your treatment protocols, and it would be unfortunate if you made this difficult. Sarah backed away, playing the terrified victim, letting them think she was cornered and helpless. Who are you? What do you want with my research? That's not your concern, the wolf replied, moving closer. All you need to know is that certain parties are very interested in your work with magical corruption. We're prepared to make it worth your while to share what you know, or we can do this the hard way, if you prefer. Before Sarah could respond, the room's temperature dropped 20 degrees in an instant, and every wolf in the space felt the overwhelming presence of an apex predator entering the field. Caden materialized from the shadows like something out of a nightmare, his corrupted wolf barely contained, his eyes blazing with that wrong yellow light. The tactical gear wolves spun toward him, weapons rising, but they were already too late. He was too fast, too strong, too far beyond them in pure predatory capability. The first wolf went down with a crushed throat before he could even scream. The second managed to get a shot off, but Caden moved through it like it was nothing, his corruption making him more resistant to damage than any normal wolf should be. He slammed the shooter into the wall hard enough to crack plaster, then turned to the third with an expression that promised violence beyond imagining. Wait! Sarah's voice cut through the bloodlust, firm and commanding despite her racing heart. We need at least one alive to question. Don't kill them all, Caden. She saw him fight with himself, saw his corrupted wolf demanding blood and his rational mind recognizing the truth in her words. Finally, he nodded sharply, though his claws stayed embedded in the third wolf's shoulder. Talk, he growled, his voice barely human. Who sent you? And what's the endgame with the corruption magic? The captured wolf tried to maintain silence, but Caden's patience had worn thin years ago. He applied pressure to the shoulder wound, not enough to kill, but more than enough to convince. I don't have time for loyalty. You either tell me what I want to know, or I peel you apart piece by piece until your wolf breaks and tells me itself. Choose quickly. Under that kind of pressure, resistance. crumbled. The wolf spilled everything. A conspiracy that went deeper and darker than either Sarah or Caden had imagined. There was a group calling themselves the Old Pack. Wolves who believed the Council's rules had made packs weak and wanted to return to the brutal hierarchies of the pre-Council era. They'd been experimenting with forbidden magic for decades, perfecting corruption techniques that could be used to eliminate opposition or create controllable weapons. Caden had been their first large-scale test, an attempt to see if they could break a powerful alpha without actually killing him. "There are others," the wolf gasped out, as Caden's claws dug deeper. 5 more alphas already corrupted and being monitored. Some know what's happening to them. Others think it's natural degradation. The Old Pack plans to let them destabilize their territories, then move in with offers of help and treatment, using it as leverage to rebuild the old power structures. Sarah felt sick to her stomach. This wasn't just about Caden, or even just about pack politics. This was a coordinated assault on everything the Council had built, using the most vulnerable wolves as weapons and pawns. "Who leads the Old Pack? Give us names." The wolf hesitated, genuine fear crossing his face. Whatever consequences awaited him for talking were clearly worse than anything Caden could do. But survival instinct won out, and he provided 3 names, all of them respected alphas currently attending the summit. Wolves who sat on the Council, who held positions of authority and trust, who'd been secretly working to dismantle everything from the inside. Caden's expression went absolutely cold, and Sarah recognized the look. He was calculating death, planning how to eliminate 3 alphas without triggering a continental war. She stepped forward, placing a hand on his arm, grounding him before he could lose himself to that darkness. "We take this to the Council formally," she said firmly. "We have testimony, we have evidence from my research, and we have proof of an active conspiracy. Let the system work, Caden. Don't become the monster they tried to make you." She could see him wanting to argue, wanting to handle this the way he'd handled his own pack's betrayal. Quick and brutal and permanent. But after a long moment, the yellow faded from his eyes, and he nodded. "Your way first. But if the Council won't act, if they try to bury this to protect their own, then we do things my way." "Agreed?" "Agreed," Sarah confirmed, because she understood that some compromises were necessary when dealing with wolves who'd been fighting alone for so long. The emergency council session was convened within hours, all attending alphas summoned to hear testimony about a conspiracy that threatened the foundation of their society. Caden and Sarah presented their evidence methodically, the captured wolf's confession backed by Sarah's medical analysis, and Caden's testimony about his own corruption. The 3 named alphas denied everything, of course, called it a fabrication from a corrupted alpha desperate to deflect blame for his own deterioration. But the Council wasn't stupid, and when security swept their rooms and found ritual components and damning correspondence, the denials fell apart. The trial was swift by Council standards, taking only 2 days to hear evidence and render judgment. The 3 conspirators were found guilty of using forbidden magic, conspiracy to destabilize pack, territories, and attempted murder of Council wolves. Their sentence was permanent exile, their packs to be dissolved and absorbed by neighboring territories, and most critically, a continental-wide investigation into any other old pack members or corrupted alphas. Caden sat through the entire proceeding with rigid control, watching the wolves who'd orchestrated his torture face consequences that didn't remotely match their crimes. Sarah saw the tension in every line of his body, knew he was fighting the urge to finish what the Council had left undone. But he held himself together, let the system work, even though it felt inadequate. And when it was over, when the 3 wolves were led away in Council custody, he turned to her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You were right," he said quietly as they left the Council chambers, taking it through proper channels, letting them face judgment from the system instead of from me personally. It was the right call, even if it doesn't feel satisfying. "Justice rarely does," Sarah replied gently, "but it's still better than vengeance, even when vengeance would feel good in the moment. You showed tremendous strength in there, Caden. Strength that has nothing to do with how hard you can hit, or how intimidating you can be. You showed the strength of choosing a better path, even when the easy one was right there. His hand found hers, that now familiar gesture of connection that had become natural over the past week. I couldn't have done it without you, without your belief that I was still worth saving. A week ago, I would have torn them apart in that council chamber and damned the consequences. You gave me reason to want to be better than that. They walked back to the hotel in comfortable silence, both processing the weight of what they'd just experienced and what it meant going forward. The summit was ending tomorrow. Alphas already preparing to return to their territories. Caden would go back to Shadowpine, and Sarah would return to her work with refugees in the Great Lakes region. The reality of that separation sat heavy between them, neither quite sure how to address it. "Come with me," Caden said suddenly, as they reached his room. "To Shadowpine. Not permanently. Not unless you want that. But at least until we're sure the corruption won't resurge. You've got treatment protocols established, but they'll need monitoring and adjustment. I'd rather have the person who actually knows what they're doing overseeing my recovery than trying to manage it alone." Sarah's heart did something complicated in her chest. Hope and fear and possibility all tangled together. That's not a small ask. Shadowpine is your territory, your home. Having an outsider Omega there, especially one associated with helping you, it's going to raise questions from your pack. Let them question, Caden said, with more confidence than she'd heard from him yet. I'm done hiding and isolating. My pack deserves to know what was done to me and how we're fixing it. And honestly, I don't want to go back to being alone. This past week, having someone to talk to, someone who sees me as more than just the beast of Shadowpine, it's reminded me what I've been missing, what I want to rebuild. The vulnerability in that admission, the hope and fear and desperate want, made Sarah's decision easy. Okay, I'll come to Shadowpine. Not permanently at first, just until we're confident your recovery is stable. But Caden, you need to understand something. If I come there, I'm not just going to treat you and hide in a medical facility. I'm going to help other wolves too, ones who need healing that they're not getting. That's who I am. I wouldn't want you any other way, he replied. And she believed him. In fact, I've been thinking. Shadowpine used to have a comprehensive medical program before the betrayal. Healers, counselors, support systems for wolves dealing with trauma or illness. I dismantled all of that in the aftermath because I couldn't trust anyone. But with your help, we could rebuild it. Make Shadowpine somewhere wolves come for healing instead of somewhere they avoid out of fear. The vision he painted was beautiful and ambitious. Exactly the kind of transformative work that Sarah had dedicated her life to. That would take time, and resources, and a lot of wolves willing to give your territory a second chance. We have time now, thanks to you, Caden pointed out. 2 to 3 years instead of 6 months. And my territory has resources. What it's been lacking is hope and purpose. Give me those things, Sarah. Help me turn Shadowpine into something better than what it was. Please. How could she say no to that? To the chance to not just save one wolf but transform an entire territory. To build something meaningful from the ruins of betrayal and corruption. Sarah nodded, feeling rightness settle into her bones. Okay, let's do it. Let's make Shadowpine a sanctuary for healing instead of a monument to pain. The smile Caden gave her was radiant, transforming his scarred face into something beautiful. He pulled her into a hug, careful despite his strength, and Sarah wrapped her arms around him in return. They stood like that for a long moment, two damaged souls finding unexpected hope in each other, making silent promises about the future they'd build together. Make sure to hit that subscribe button, because the story of Caden and Sarah is far from over. Watch what happens when they return to Shadowpine and begin the work of transforming not just one alpha, but an entire pack culture, and discover that sometimes the greatest healing happens when you open your heart to someone else's pain. The journey to Shadowpine took 2 days, traveling through territories that gave them wide berth once they recognized Caden's vehicle. Sarah used the time to learn more about his pack, the history and traditions that had made Shadowpine strong. before the betrayal shattered everything. Caden spoke carefully at first, like he was testing whether she'd judge him for caring about wolves, who'd ultimately let conspiracy flourish in their midst. But Sarah understood pack dynamics, knew that betrayal from leadership didn't make every wolf complicit, and her questions were curious rather than accusatory. "What happened to your pack after you killed the conspirators?" she asked, as they crossed into Shadowpine territory. "Did they stay, or did wolves leave?" "About 30% left within." "The first year," Caden admitted, his hands tight on the steering wheel. "Most were family or close friends of the wolves I'd killed. Couldn't stay knowing what I'd done even if they understood why. Another 20% trickled out over the following 2 years as it became clear I wasn't going to recover, that the corruption was progressive. The ones who stayed are either loyal beyond reason, too afraid to leave, or hoping I'll die soon and they can rebuild under new leadership." "Titan." Bitterness in his voice was understandable, but Sarah heard something else beneath it. Hurt that his pack had fractured. Guilt that his condition had driven wolves away. Desperate hope that maybe things could be different now. "How many are left?" "Around 300 adult wolves, another 100 pups and teens. We were close to 800 at our peak." He paused, then added quietly, "I don't blame the ones who left. I wouldn't want to live with me either if I had the choice." "Stop that," Sarah said firmly. "You're not some unbearable monster who drove everyone away. You're a wolf dealing with magical corruption inflicted by traitors, and you've been doing it without support or treatment for 3 years. The fact that 300 wolves stayed despite everything says something important about who you were before and who they believe you can still be." Shadowpine territory was stunning, she discovered as they drove deeper into packlands. Dense forests giving way to mountain. Vistas, clear rivers and hidden valleys that felt almost untouched by human development. The pack center sat in one such valley, a combination of traditional longhouses and modern buildings that spoke to a pack that honored history while embracing progress, or had, before everything fell apart. The reaction to their arrival was immediate and visceral. Wolves emerged from buildings to watch their alpha return, and Sarah could see the shock ripple through the crowd as they registered the changes in him. The corruption scars visibly faded, his eyes clear and steady instead of that flickering yellow madness, his movements controlled rather than barely restrained violence. And beside him, an unknown Omega, who somehow hadn't been killed on sight. Caden stood in the center of his pack and did something Sarah suspected he hadn't done in 3 years. He addressed them directly, his voice carrying across the gathering with alpha command that had nothing to do with corruption and everything to do with natural authority. "I know what you've been living with. A broken alpha slowly deteriorating, isolated and dangerous, offering no leadership beyond keeping threats away from our borders. That changes today. This is Sarah Whitlock, an Omega healer who's developed treatment for magical corruption. She's given me back my future, and I'm inviting her to stay in Shadowpine to continue treatment and rebuild our medical programs." Silence met this announcement. Wolves processing information that contradicted 3 years of lived experience. Finally, an older female wolf stepped forward, someone Sarah recognized from Caden's stories as Diana, one of his mother's closest friends, and one of the few wolves he still trusted. "You're saying you can be cured? That the corruption isn't permanent?" "Not cured, not completely," Caden corrected honestly, "but managed, treated, controlled. I have years instead of months now, and Sarah believes with sustained treatment, we might extend that even further. The important thing is I'm not deteriorating anymore. I'm healing, and I want to use that time to rebuild what was destroyed, to make Shadowpine strong again." Diana's gaze shifted to Sarah, assessing and cautious but not hostile. "What do you get out of this, healer? Why risk yourself in a territory that's been unstable for years?" It was a fair question, and Sarah answered it directly. "Because your alpha deserves better than dying alone from poison inflicted by traitors. Because I've dedicated my life to helping wolves everyone else has given up on. And because I believe Shadowpine can be something special. A place where healing isn't just available but prioritized. Where wolves come for help instead of hiding their wounds. That's worth risking myself for." She watched calculation happen behind Diana's eyes. saw the older wolf weighing truth against self-interest, looking for angles and agendas. Finally, Diana nodded slowly. The pack will judge you by results, healer. Whitlock. Prove that our alpha is truly healing. Prove that you're here to help rather than exploit. And you'll find Shadowpine wolves fiercely loyal. Fail, and you'll understand why we're cautious about outsiders making promises. That's fair. Sarah agreed easily. I don't expect trust I haven't earned. Just give me the chance to earn it. Caden showed her to quarters in the main house, rooms that had belonged to his beta before the betrayal, and had sat empty since. They were spacious and comfortable, positioned close to his own chambers in a way that announced she had alpha access and protection. As they toured the space, Sarah made mental notes of what she'd need to establish proper medical facilities, equipment and supplies she'd have to order, modifications to make the space functional for treating patients. I need to visit the pack's old medical center, she said once they'd finished the tour. See what's salvageable and what needs to be replaced. If we're going to rebuild the program, I need to understand what we're working with. The medical center was in the pack's administrative building, a full floor that had once housed examination rooms, a surgical suite, counseling offices, and a dispensary. Now it sat empty and gathering dust, equipment covered in sheets, files boxed away, a monument to everything Caden had dismantled in the aftermath of betrayal. Sarah walked through the space slowly, her healer's instincts cataloging both what existed and what was, missing building plans for how to make this functional again. Why did you shut it all down? She asked, as they explored the abandoned surgical suite. I understand not trusting the specific healers who worked here before, but why close everything completely? Caden leaned against a covered examination table, his expression distant with painful memory. Because I couldn't separate the healing from the betrayal. Our head healer, Marcus's mate, she'd been part of the conspiracy, had used her, positioned to keep me calm when I should have been suspicious, to explain away symptoms of the initial corruption as stress and overwork. When I realized she'd been actively helping poison me while pretending to care for my health, it broke something. I couldn't trust healers after that. Couldn't let anyone in medical authority close enough to hurt me again. Understanding settled over Sarah, sad and inevitable. He hadn't just been betrayed by his mate in Beta. He'd been betrayed by the person responsible for his health and well-being, someone whose entire role was built on trust and vulnerability. No wonder he'd isolated so completely. I'm sorry. That's a violation that cuts especially deep. Yeah, Caden agreed quietly. So I shut it all down, sent the remaining healers away, locked the doors, and told myself we didn't need medical support anyway. Pack wolves could go to human hospitals if necessary, but we wouldn't have that vulnerability in-house anymore. He looked around the abandoned space with obvious regret. I see now how stupid that was. How many wolves suffered because I was too broken to separate past betrayal from present needs. But at the time, it felt like the only way to stay safe. Sarah moved to stand beside him, shoulder to shoulder in that dusty surgical suite. Two people looking at the physical manifestation of trauma's aftermath. Trauma makes us do things that seem irrational from the outside but make perfect sense when you're just trying to survive. You're not stupid for protecting yourself the only way you knew how. You're just finally in a place where you can start building something better. They spent the rest of the day making lists and plans, Sarah cataloging what needed to be ordered, Caden identifying pack members who might be interested in medical training or support roles. It was practical work, the kind of concrete tasks that made overwhelming projects feel manageable. But beneath the practicality, Sarah felt something, shifting between them, a partnership forming that went beyond healer and patient. Over the following weeks, Shadowpine began to transform. Sarah's treatment protocols kept Caden's corruption stable and slowly pushing it further back, his physical and mental state improving week by week. But more than that, his visible healing gave the pack hope that change was possible, that maybe their alpha could be the wolf he'd been before. Wolves who'd been keeping their distance started approaching him. Again, tentatively at first, testing whether he was safe to be around. And Caden, with Sarah's encouragement, let them in instead of pushing them away. The medical center reopened 6 weeks after Sarah's arrival, not fully operational, but functional enough to start seeing patients for basic care. Sarah personally treated anyone who came through the doors, building trust one wolf at a time, proving through actions that she was there to help rather than exploit. And slowly, cautiously, wolves started opening up about problems they'd been hiding for years. Injuries that hadn't healed properly, mental health struggles they'd been managing alone, chronic conditions that needed ongoing treatment, but they'd been too afraid to seek help for. Caden watched this transformation with something like wonder, seeing his pack come back to life under Sarah's care. She worked long hours but never complained, treated every wolf with the same respect and compassion, regardless of their rank or history. She was everything he'd forgotten a healer could be, everything his betrayer had pretended to be but never actually was. And more than that, she'd given him back his ability to trust, to believe that vulnerability wasn't automatically a weapon someone would use against him. 3 months into her stay, Caden realized something that both terrified and excited him. He was falling in love with Sarah Whitlock. It wasn't the mate bond, which he'd felt once before, and knew this was different. This was choice, conscious and deliberate, recognizing someone whose soul resonated with his in ways that had nothing to do with fate or destiny. She saw his darkness and didn't run. She believed in his potential when no one else did. She challenged him to be better while accepting exactly who he was, and every day he spent with her made him want to be worthy of the faith she'd placed in him. The realization should have sent him running, should have triggered every defensive instinct he'd spent 3 years building. Instead, it settled into his chest like coming home, like finding something he hadn't known he was searching for. He didn't tell her, not yet, because he needed to be sure this was real, and not just desperate attachment to the first person who'd shown him kindness. But he let himself hope, cautiously and carefully, that maybe he could have this. Maybe he deserved this. Sarah, for her part, was fighting her own internal battle. She'd come to Shadowpine planning to stay a few months at most, establish Caden's treatment, set up basic medical infrastructure, then return to her refugee work in the Great Lakes. But somewhere along the way, Shadowpine had stopped feeling like a temporary assignment and started feeling like home. The wolves here needed her, trusted her, were building something meaningful under her guidance. And Caden, complicated and damaged and working so hard to heal, had become essential to her in ways she hadn't expected. She wasn't sure when her professional care had shifted into something deeper, when she'd started looking forward to their evening conversations as much as the treatment sessions, when his smile had become something she actively sought out. But she recognized the signs, had seen them enough in other people to know what was happening to her. She was falling for Caden Ashford, and that scared her more than any corrupted alpha or conspiracy ever could. Drop a comment telling me if you think they should confess their feelings or if they need more time to heal individually first. And if you're loving this story, smash that like button and share it with someone who loves supernatural romance with real emotional depth. The shift happened on a cold night 4 months into Sarah's stay, when a young wolf stumbled into the medical center bleeding from claw wounds that spoke of a territorial fight gone wrong. Sarah stabilized him quickly, but he needed surgery to repair internal damage, the kind of delicate work that required absolute precision. She'd handled procedures like this before, but never as the sole surgeon, never without backup if something went wrong. Caden appeared as she was prepping the surgical suite, somehow sensing she needed support, even though she hadn't called for him. "What do you need?" he asked simply, already rolling up his sleeves. "A second pair of hands," Sarah admitted, grateful beyond words that he'd come, "and someone to monitor vitals while I'm elbow-deep in his abdominal cavity. I can walk you through it, but you need to be able to stay calm if things go sideways." "I can do calm," Caden assured her, and she believed him. The wolf who'd barely controlled his rage 4 months ago was gone, replaced by someone who'd reclaimed his equilibrium, and then some. Together, they worked through the night, Sarah repairing damage while Caden assisted with steady hands and complete focus. It was intense and exhausting, and absolutely perfect, the kind of partnership where words became unnecessary, because they moved in sync. When it was over, when the young wolf was stable and sleeping off anesthesia. Sarah collapsed into a chair, with exhaustion and relief flooding through her. Caden sat beside her, still bloody from assisting surgery, both of them too tired to care about the mess. They sat in comfortable silence for long minutes before Caden spoke. "Thank you for letting me help, for trusting me with something this important." Sarah turned to look at him, seeing past the corruption scars, to the person underneath, the alpha who'd clawed his way back from the edge of losing himself completely. "Thank you for being someone I could trust. 4 months ago, I wasn't sure you'd be stable enough for this. Now I can't imagine doing it without you." Something shifted in his expression, vulnerability and hope and desperate want. "Sarah, I need to tell you something, and I understand if it changes things, if you need to leave after, but I can't keep pretending I don't feel it." Her heart started racing because she knew what was coming, could see it written all over his face. "Caden, I'm in love with you," he said simply. No drama or grand gestures, just honest truth laid bare. Not the mate bond, not desperate attachment, just real love for who you are and what you've given me. You make me want to be better, want to build something meaningful, want to believe in futures I'd written off. And I understand if you don't feel the same, if I'm just a patient or a project or someone you care about professionally. But I needed you to know. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, because his timing was both terrible and perfect. Because she'd been fighting these same feelings for weeks. Because hearing him say it out loud broke something open in her chest. "You're an idiot," she said. But there was no heat in it, just exasperated fondness. "How could you think you're just a patient? Caden, I've been in love with you for weeks, maybe longer. I kept telling myself it was professional attachment, that I was just invested in your recovery. But that's bullshit. I love you. Scars and trauma, and complicated history and all." The smile that broke across his face was radiant, joy transforming him into something beautiful, despite the corruption marks still visible across his skin. He reached for her slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, and when she didn't, when she leaned into his touch, he cupped her face with careful hands and kissed her like she was something precious and fragile. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, both of them testing whether this was real or if reality would crash in and remind them why this was complicated. But it deepened naturally. 3 months of tension and want and careful dancing around each other, finally finding release. Sarah's hands fisted in his shirt, pulling him closer, and Caden responded by lifting her completely, setting her on the surgical prep table so they were eye to eye, so he could kiss her. Properly without the height difference. They broke apart eventually, both breathing hard, foreheads pressed together in the dimly lit surgical suite, surrounded by the evidence of the life they'd saved together. "This is probably wildly inappropriate," Sarah said breathlessly. "Making out in a medical facility after surgery. Definitely inappropriate." Caden agreed, not moving away even slightly. "We should probably go somewhere else. My rooms maybe, or yours. Somewhere with actual beds and fewer medical supplies." They made it approximately halfway to his quarters, before Caden had her pressed against a hallway wall, kissing her like he was drowning, and she was air. Sarah wrapped her legs around his waist, let him carry her the rest of the way, while exploring his mouth with thorough enthusiasm. By the time they reached his rooms, clothes were already being shed, hands mapping skin they'd only seen in clinical contexts, discovering each other with reverent enthusiasm. Caden laid her on his bed with a gentleness that made her chest tight, looking at her like she was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. "Are you sure?" he asked, even though she could feel exactly how much he wanted this. "We don't have to rush. I've waited 3 years to feel anything good. I can wait longer if you need time." "I'm sure," Sarah confirmed, pulling him down into another kiss. "I want this. I want you. No more waiting. No more pretending we're just healer and patient. I want everything, Caden." He made love to her with the same focused intensity he brought to everything else, learning her body with patient thoroughness, making sure she was mindless with pleasure before letting himself follow. It was intense and perfect, and exactly what both of them needed. physical intimacy that confirmed what they'd been building emotionally for months. Afterward, they lay tangled together, Sarah tracing the corruption scars across his chest while Caden played with her hair, both of them quiet and content. "I should probably tell you," Caden said eventually, "that I have no idea how to be in a relationship anymore. The last time I tried, it ended in betrayal and magical corruption. I'm going to be terrible at this, probably paranoid and overprotective and stupidly insecure about whether you're going to leave." Sarah propped herself up on one elbow, looking down at him with affection and exasperation. "And I should tell you that I have massive trust issues stemming from abuse. I'm hypersensitive to any sign of controlling behavior, and I'll probably push you away the moment you get too close, because that's my defense mechanism. So we're both going to be terrible at this together, which means we're perfectly matched." That got a laugh from him, genuine and unguarded, the kind of laugh she suspected he hadn't made in years. "So we're doing this? Actually trying for a real relationship despite all our baggage and complications? We're doing this," Sarah confirmed. "Together, with all our damage and healing and complicated history. We'll figure it out as we go." They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other. Two people who'd been broken by betrayal and trauma, finding hope and healing in each other. It wasn't a fairy tale ending where love magically fixed everything. Caden still had corruption to manage. Sarah still had trust issues to work through. Shadowpine still needed massive rebuilding. But they had each other now. Had chosen each other despite everything. And that made all the difference. Over the following months, they built something beautiful together. Sarah officially accepted a permanent position as Shadowpine's head healer, establishing comprehensive medical programs that became a model for other territories. Caden continued healing, his corruption pushed back so far it was barely detectable, his leadership stabilizing and strengthening the pack. They worked together to transform Shadowpine from a place people avoided into somewhere wolves actively sought refuge, knowing they'd find support and healing. There were challenges, of course. Some pack members struggled with accepting an outsider Omega in such a position of authority and intimacy with their alpha. Old traumas resurfaced at unexpected moments, testing their relationship. The old pack investigation continued, revealing more conspirators and corrupted wolves who needed help. But they faced each challenge together. Caden and Sarah, alpha and healer, partners, in every sense that mattered. A year into their relationship, Caden proposed, not with grand gestures or public spectacle, but privately in the medical center where they'd first truly connected, where he'd let himself be vulnerable enough to accept help. "I want forever with you," he said simply, offering a ring that had belonged to his grandmother, not as some desperate attempt to hold on to the one person who saved me, but as a conscious choice to build a life with someone I love and respect. "Marry me, Sarah. Make Shadowpine truly ours together." She said yes without hesitation, because this was exactly what she wanted, who she wanted, the future she'd been building toward since that first day when she'd seen past his monster reputation to the suffering wolf beneath. They married simply, surrounded by pack, and the wolves whose lives they'd changed, celebrating not just their union, but the transformation they'd achieved together. 5 years after that first summit meeting, Shadowpine was thriving. The medical center treated wolves from across the continent, Sarah's techniques for handling magical corruption becoming standard practice. Caden's corruption was so diminished it was barely detectable, his prognosis upgraded from terminal to manageable chronic condition. Their relationship had deepened into the kind of partnership that inspired others, proving that even the most damaged wolves could heal and love and build something meaningful. And late at night, when they lay together in the darkness, Sarah would sometimes trace the faded corruption scars on Caden's face and remember the first time she'd whispered those magic words. "You're safe now." She'd meant it then as comfort to someone suffering, but now she understood it was also a promise, one they'd both kept, building safety together from the ruins of betrayal and trauma. They'd taken their brokenness and forged something stronger, proving that the most powerful magic wasn't corruption or mate bonds, but simply choosing to see someone's humanity and refusing to give up on them. And that, more than anything else, was the true healing that transformed both of them completely. If this story touched your heart, please share it with others who need to know that healing is possible even after the darkest betrayals. Hit that like button, leave a comment about your favorite moment, and subscribe for more stories about broken wolves finding love and redemption. Because everyone deserves to be seen, to be helped, to be told that they're safe now, and that their darkest moment doesn't have to define their future.